In this video, we are going to check out an absolutely fascinating, epic game between two super grandmasters, rated over 2700 with the white pieces. It's Yu Yangyi, and he's playing against the one and only Hans Niemann. They are both rated around world's number 25. It's very close to each other, but Hans is in super form in the Turkish League, trying to win more and more rating points, climb up the ladder to reach the top 20, eventually maybe even the top 10 in the world. I mean, it's still a long way to go. And in this game, he's facing a real test against Yu Yangyi, very solid player, difficult to beat. But let's see what's happening in this game. Just before we go there, make sure to turn on the notifications, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and consider making a PayPal donation to support the channel. Really, thank you very much, all you guys, for the overwhelming support. I really need it to keep this channel alive. So make sure to make a good move. Now, it's my turn again, and I will show you what happened. Yu Yangyi started the game with one knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, e6. Typical opening moves, castling kingside, bishop e7. White goes for the move c4, castling kingside. And here, the main move for white is to play d4, leading to the main lines of the Catalan. That's not what we're going to see in this game. Strangely enough, here Yu Yangyi decided to take on d5. It has been seen before, has even been played in a number of games by former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. But to me, it is a small positional concession. Why? Because after pawn takes d5, all of a sudden it will become much easier for black to develop the bishop to a more active square, maybe g4, maybe f5, depending on how play is gonna proceed in the next couple of moves. Here b3 is played, and I'm pretty sure this should not have come as a surprise to Hans, because a few months ago Yu Yangyi played this exact line in the Sharjah Masters against a talented player from France, Maurizi, and in that game the move c5 was played, but Hans goes for the move bishop f5, developing the bishop to an active square. Bishop b2, knight bd7, white goes for the move d3, and here h6. This is a typical move if you're familiar with the Reti opening with knight f3, g3, bishop g2. You know that very often it is quite useful for the bishop to drop back to that square. So it's far away being placed, it cannot easily be challenged, and it still keeps an eye on the center. Well, that's exactly what happens here as well. Knight bd2, the bishop indeed goes back to h7, queen c2, rook e8, and well, if you compare this with the Reti opening, very often black has already played the move c6, especially in the Slav type of structures. That's a very common move, trying to set up a block against the bishop on g2. But Hans has different, more ambitious ideas. Rook ad1 played. Now the bishop goes back to f8, typical move to clear the path for the rook on the e-file, hitting the pawn on e2, rook f e1, and now we see the difference. Black is not going to play the move c6, but Hans played here the move c5, so he's trying to grab space. Very ambitious move. Now this is an interesting moment in the game, because what is white going to do? White has played the first 13 moves of the game in a very modest way. You would expect white to try to strike back in the center, maybe play a move like e4, but I guess that white didn't want to play it because of the move d4, when the bishop on b2 is kind of boxed in. And well, it's not an easy game. It's still very interesting. I mean, it can become razor sharp if white is going to play something like b4, with the idea that if you take on b4, bishop takes d4, white has the advantage in the center, but black has a majority on the queen side. Well, we never know what would have happened. Yu Yangyi decided to play still in a very calm manner with the move queen b1, rook c8, bishop h3, putting more pressure on this diagonal. And one of the main threats here is actually to take with the bishop on f6 when the knight cannot recapture, as the rook on c8 is hanging. And you can also not take back with the queen, because that hangs the knight on d7, which means after bishop takes f6, g takes f6 is only move. But that's a serious weakening move for your king. So after the move d4, now this idea of white is no longer possible. This bishop is out of play. White played the move e3. So interesting, what is going to happen in the next couple of moves? Maybe if you take on e3, the center will get open, but Hans doesn't want it. Hans has a different idea. He played a move b5. Is this a pawn sacrifice, guys? Look at this. If you take on d4, if black is taking back, well, the pawn is just hanging. Don't do that. But I'm pretty sure that the idea here is to put the pawn on c4. And look at this bishop. It's eyeing the queen. And the pawn on d3 is pinned. White, of course, cannot take twice on c4. If you take with the knight, there is a rook takes c4. Black is winning a piece. After pawn takes, it's bishop takes b1. So that's the idea of Hans. With his move b5, he is discouraging white from playing the move pawn takes d4. White played instead a move e4. So we have a close position. Both the bishop on b2 and the bishop on h7. They seem to be out of play. But this is a very important and instructive moment, because the next move played by Hans Niemann is probably something you would not have even considered. Look at this. g7, g5, pushing a pawn in front of your king 2 squares. This seems to be very weakening, but there is a huge threat of g4 hitting both the bishop and the knight. Bishop goes back to g2, but here the pawn goes to g4 anyway, deflecting the knight from its central post. Knight h4 played, only available square for the knight, but the main point of black's play is that now the knight can come in to the e5 square. This is a beautiful square for the knight. It cannot be chased away by a pawn. Well, in fact, the move f4 was played, but there is capturing en passant. G takes f3, knight takes f3, and here the other knight comes to g4 to support the knight on e5. And who knows, maybe the knight wants to come to e3 as well. But look at this. This is very important. Knight takes e5 played. You gotta recapture with the knight. If you take with the rook, white will play h3. And if your plan was to go knight e3, this is a serious blunder. There's rook takes e3. And after taking, there's bishop takes e5. White emerges with an extra piece. So you should not go in with a knight to e3. You should take back with a knight on e5. Maintain the blockade. That's a very important move, so that the bishop on g2 remains very passive. Knight f3, bishop to g7. Well, you may consider trading off knights already. First bishop c1 was played. But now it's knight takes f3, bishop takes f3. And look at this, Hans breaks through in the center with the move c4. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Again, pawn takes, rook takes c4. And black is having a passed pawn, which can count on the support of these 3 pieces. White's king is open, black's king is open as well. But the 2 bishops are replacing the task of the pawn. So the bishops fantastically guarding the king, but exerting pressure on the center, supporting the passed pawn and hitting the pawn on e4. Rook d3, the rook is a blockading piece now, supporting the bishop, making sure that this pawn cannot be pushed. Queen a5, hitting the rook on e1. Bishop to d2, queen c5, centralizing the queen, supporting the rook. Queen b3. And now, nice, calm move, bishop g6. I really like this idea. So that whenever it's needed, the king can always hide on h7. a4 played, queen c7. Now we see a lot of maneuvering. It's very difficult for both sides to make progress. It's difficult for black to challenge the blockading piece. But we are not in a rush. As black, rook b1, king h7. So the king is leaving the back rank. a5 played. Rook c2. The rook is coming in, exerting pressure here. Bishop d1, the rook goes back to c5. Bishop back to f3. Now, this pawn on e4 is actually hanging. You may consider taking it. But if you do so, you're even help white to get rid of his worst piece. And apparently, in a line like this, attacking the pawn on f7 and the queen coming in to d3, you're pawn down. But white has quite some counterplay here. It's not really clear what black should do to take advantage of the extra pawn. Well, instead, after bishop f3, black didn't play the move bishop takes e4. Played instead queen c6, attacking the pawn one more time. Queen b7, the queen comes in, offering the exchange of queens, hits the pawn on a7. And Hans had a clear idea. Once again, he doesn't really want to take on e4, but he played here the move queen a4. Very interesting idea. As his idea is that in case of queen takes pawn on a7, there's queen c2 with a double attack against these rooks. It's super tactical now, and black is able to destroy the blockade. For instance, if you play rook bb3 to keep everything defended, rooks are protecting each other. Rook on d3 supports the bishop. There is rook b5. And now you cannot defend the rook on b3. If rook takes b5, queen takes d3, and everything all of a sudden is unprotected. Well, therefore, black is really threatening to break into white's position. White better decides to come back with queen b3. Prevents this threat. Queen d7 back. Lot of back and forth by both sides. Queen b7. Now, once again, white would be relieved to exchange queens, but rook c7, keeping everything under control. Queen b5, queen e6, keeping the rook defended, attacking the pawn on e4 one more time. Rook e1, rook ec8. Black is clearly better, but still not able to break through. Queen a6, so that the queen on b3 got to keep the rook defended. Bishop e2, queen c6 now. Bishop g4 hitting the rook on c8, rook e8. Rook c1, attacking the queen. Queen e4 is possible, but there is rook takes c7, was all not played in the game, because after the exchange of pieces, well, there's also rook takes a7, and which pawn is stronger, the a pawn or the d pawn? Well, I would start feeling scared here as black. So instead, black should maintain the tension. Queen d6 played, now only the rooks are coming off the board. And I think it's a very clever decision to keep queens on the board, because I believe potentially the white king is more vulnerable than the black king. Bishop f5 played, and now very interesting moment in this game. What to do? You may consider just taking on f5 and take it from there. Maybe rook b8, try to infiltrate via the queen side, and who knows, this pawn is not too dangerous. It also gives some protection to the king. There's never really a serious check here, but Hans had a different idea. He went for this exchange sacrifice, but in fact it's not really an exchange sacrifice, it's a temporal one, because after taking on e4, bishop takes e4, the rook on d3 is not really able to move anywhere. If it goes somewhere, well, let's say if you instead make this move bishop f4 to hit the queen and enable the rook to go away, you can just take another pawn on a5, and here black will be able to make a lot of progress, either to take the rook, or if the rook goes away, d3 will come with bishop coming into d4. Tremendous pressure against the king. So instead, white moved the rook to f3, but bishop takes, queen takes, black has won a pawn, brings the queen to c2. Big moment in the game, because black is a pawn up, and what should white do? To me, the most natural move would be queen f4, just to keep everything defended. I mean, you can try to set up some sort of a fortress and your pawn down, but this d pawn is difficult to mobilize. If you push it, there's queen e4. Now the diagonal for the queen on c2 is closed. It's no longer defending the own king, and there's a lot of counterplay in this case. So queen f4 is a very stubborn defensive attempt with still good drawing chances here for white. But interestingly, Yu Yangyi comes up with this idea. He gives up the bishop on d2. Queen takes f7, and now after queen takes d2, he probably believed that there is a perpetual. Like, there are a bunch of checks, and if indeed, if you go back to h8, there is queen c8, and the queen comes back to f5 with a repetition of moves. But there's king g8, queen e6, king f8, queen d6, king f7, queen d5, king e7, queen e4, king f6. Where is this king going? Queen c6, king f5, queen d7. It is a double attack on the king and bishop. King g6, queen e8, king g5, queen b5 again. And, well, there is king g4. The king is moving up The board is not afraid at all. Queen d7, once again, it is a double attack. But look at this, it is king f3 now. It's a winning king walk, as if you take the bishop, there's queen g2 or queen d1 or queen e1 with checkmate. So that is not possible. You should keep on giving checks as white. Queen f7 was played, king e2, queen f1, king e3, queen f4, king d3, queen f5, a bunch of checks again. The king is forced now to go to the other side of the board. Queen c8, king b3, queen g8, king c2. And now you understand that if you give a check here, it is king to d1, and the king is relatively safe now again. So finally the bishop is taken, but there is queen e3, king g2, and d3. Now the d pawn is really strong and only 2 squares away from becoming a new queen. Queen c7, king d1. Look at this. The queen on e3 is fantastically placed. Typical for queen endgames. It's defending both pawns. Queen b7 played by white. What is the idea? Well, this is one of the last little traps in the game. Well, it's actually a big trap. Don't push your pawn to d2, guys. It's a famous endgame trap. Queen endgames, you see this idea. It's queen b1, king e2, queen f1 with checkmate. White can still win the game in a queen endgame. So you gotta be precise. Instead of pushing the pawn, you better give a check first. King h3, king e1. And now you're making sure that the pawn is able to be pushed. Now, for instance, if you take on a7, there is d2. And on the next move, there will be d1 queen. If you give a check on g1, there's counter check. Another very important endgame technique. Forcing the exchange of queens, and white's pawn is way too slow. Black is first to promote the pawn. So instead, Yu Yangyi played a6, trying to get some counterplay in, but there's d2. Black is first. Queen b4, pinning the d pawn. So you cannot push your d pawn here yet, but there's king f1. Very good move. If you give a check on b1, it's d1 queen. That doesn't help. Black is winning that. So queen f4 played. King to g1. Still the threat of d1 queen is there. Queen d4 on the board. And well, here queen f2 was played. That is the final move of the game. Move 75. Very, very nice idea, because of course white is not going to exchange queens, but if you keep queens on the board, then you give a check first, and after the king goes away, the queen is now supporting the promotion of the other pawn. You're having an extra queen, and therefore Yu Yangyi resigned. Fascinating battle. Hans playing super aggressively from the very start. You can also say that Yu Yangyi played very passive. I mean, this modest setup, it is a good strategy if you want to get a game, but against stronger players, it's also a concession. Hans grabs space in the center, and particularly that idea with g5, bringing the pawn to g4, installing a knight on e5, and later break through in the center with the move c4. It really gave him very good practical prospects, and maybe white could have saved somehow, but it's a practical game, guys. It's not engine against engine. It is very difficult to defend such positions being under pressure for a long period of time. So I thought a very impressive game by Hans Niemann. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of it? Hit the subscribe button. That's what you gotta do, guys. Don't hold back. Help me to grow the channel, and I'll be back with more exciting games from Hans Niemann and many other top players. So stay tuned for more. Bye bye.